Aeroplanes were meant to lift people above the world, to shrink distances and blur differences. At least that was the idea printed in glossy airline magazines tucked into seatback pockets. In reality, airplanes often did the opposite. They compressed strangers into narrow aisles and exposed the quiet assumptions people carried with them, assumptions that surfaced the moment something went wrong. The gate area was crowded and loud, a mix of rolling suitcases, crying children, and boarding announcements echoing through metallic speakers. Passengers clustered into loose lines according to zones, clutching boarding passes like proof of belonging. Near the front of the line stood an elderly black woman named Evelyn Cotter. Her hair was silver and tightly curled, her posture slightly bent with age. One hand rested on a polished wooden cane, the other held a small handbag worn soft from years of use. She wore a light gray coat and sensible shoes, the kind chosen for comfort rather than style. Evelyn watched the aircraft through the tall windows. She had flown many times before, long enough to remember when people dressed up for flights, when being airborne still felt like a miracle. This trip mattered more than most. Her youngest sister was sick, and Evelyn was determined to be there, even though her knees ached and standing too long made her back throb. She had requested boarding assistance when she booked the ticket, the airline agent assuring her it would be no problem. When the boarding call finally came, first-class passengers were invited forward. A line formed quickly. At the aircraft door stood a young flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform. His name tag read, Daniel. He looked efficient, polished, and slightly tense, as if he were running through a checklist in his head. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, waiting for a pause so she wouldn't hold anyone up. She smiled politely and lifted her boarding pass. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but soft. "I was told I'd have assistance boarding. My knees aren't what they used to be." Daniel glanced at her, then at the growing line behind her. His eyes flicked briefly to her cane, then away. "Ma'am, boarding assistance is for passengers who really can't manage the stairs," he said. His tone was clipped, professional, but impatient. "If you can walk, you'll need to board with your group." Evelyn blinked, taken aback. "I can walk," she replied, "but it's difficult. I was told someone would help me." Daniel sighed, the sound sharp. "We're very busy right now. You'll need to step aside and wait until general boarding is complete." Behind Evelyn, a middle-aged white man in an expensive coat shifted his weight and cleared his throat loudly. A younger woman rolled her eyes, checking her phone. The pressure of their impatience pressed against Evelyn's back. "I don't want to cause trouble," Evelyn said, her voice tightening. "I just need a little help." Daniel straightened, his jaw set. "Ma'am, please move out of the way. You're holding up the line." The words stung more than Evelyn expected. She had spent a lifetime learning how to make herself small, how to avoid being labeled difficult. Heat rose to her face, not from anger at first, but from embarrassment. Slowly, she stepped to the side, gripping her cane harder than before. As she waited, she watched other passengers approach the door. A white woman about her age arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by another attendant. Daniel's demeanor changed instantly. He smiled, leaned down slightly, and spoke gently. "We'll take good care of you, don't worry," he said, guiding her smoothly onto the plane. Evelyn noticed the ease of it, the unquestioned acceptance. No sigh, no lecture about holding up the line. A tall, black man in a tailored suit stood a few steps behind Evelyn. Having witnessed the exchange, his brow furrowed, he leaned toward her slightly. "Ma'am, did you ask for assistance?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Evelyn replied, keeping her eyes forward. "They said to wait." The man looked back at Daniel, then at the other passengers being waved through. His lips pressed into a thin line. He stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She requested assistance. Why was it denied?" Daniel stiffened. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "It does," the man replied, "because I just watched you assist someone else with no issue." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Some pretended not to listen, eyes fixed anywhere but the scene unfolding. Others watched openly, curiosity flickering across their faces. Daniel's cheeks flushed. "We assist those who require it," he said. "She can stand and walk. So can that woman in the wheelchair," the man said evenly. "With help. That's the point." Daniel glanced around, aware of the attention. "Ma'am, if you feel you were treated unfairly, You can speak to customer service after boarding. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. A familiar heaviness settled in her chest, a mix of fatigue and resignation. She had heard variations of this her whole life. Later, somewhere else, not now. Another flight attendant, an older woman with kind eyes, approached the door, sensing tension. "What's going on?" she asked. Daniel explained quickly, framing it as a misunderstanding, emphasizing delays and procedures. The older attendant looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, and then at the cane, the slight tremor in her hands. "Ma'am," she said gently, "did you request assistance?" "Yes," Evelyn answered. The attendant nodded once. "Then you should receive it." She turned to Daniel. "I'll take care of this." Daniel hesitated, then stepped back. The older attendant offered Evelyn her arm. "Take your time," she said softly. As they moved toward the aircraft door, Evelyn felt the weight in her chest loosen just a little. But the damage had already been done. The humiliation lingered, sharp and sour. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. First class was quiet, wrapped in muted colors and low voices. Evelyn was guided to her seat carefully. The attendant made sure her bag was stowed and her cane placed within reach. "Thank you," Evelyn said, meeting her eyes. "I appreciate it." "I'm sorry you had that experience," the attendant replied. "You didn't deserve it." Those words mattered more than Evelyn expected. She nodded, swallowing hard. The man in the suit took a seat nearby. He caught Evelyn's eye and offered a small, reassuring smile. She returned it, grateful for the solidarity of a stranger. As boarding continued, whispers traveled through the cabin. Some passengers shook their heads in disapproval, others in discomfort. A few looked annoyed, as if the incident itself was the inconvenience. Daniel remained near the door, his expression tight. He avoided looking toward Evelyn's seat. To him, it had been a minor disruption, a moment already slipping into the background noise of a long workday. He did not feel cruel. He felt efficient, but efficiency had a cost, one Evelyn had paid countless times. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Evelyn gazed out the window. The ground crew moved with practiced precision, their fluorescent vests bright against the gray tarmac. She thought of her sister, waiting, and of all the times she had swallowed indignities because pushing back felt too exhausting. The man beside her spoke quietly. "I'm glad someone stepped in," he said. "So am I," Evelyn replied. "But it shouldn't take that," he nodded. "No, it shouldn't." The plane lifted into the sky, city lights shrinking beneath them. Up here, everyone shared the same air, the same destination. But Evelyn knew that even at 30,000 feet, equality was fragile. It depended on who was believed, who was helped without question, and who was asked to step aside and wait. She settled back into her seat, closing her eyes. She was tired, but she was also resolved. The world might keep testing her patience, her dignity, her right to simple kindness, and she would keep boarding anyway, one slow step at a time, refusing to disappear. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, Daniel completed his checks, unaware that the brief encounter at the door would linger far longer for Evelyn than it ever would for him. The plane cruised steadily forward, carrying with it a story that would be told again, because it had been told before, and because until things changed it would need to be told again. As the seatbelt sign chimed on, Evelyn adjusted herself carefully, easing the pressure on her knees. The cabin settled into that familiar rhythm of flight, the hum of engines, the rustle of magazines, the quiet choreography of attendants preparing for departure. From the outside, everything looked calm again, as if nothing unusual had happened. But calm, Evelyn knew, was often just silence wearing a polite face. She glanced down at her hands resting in her lap. They were steady now, but moments ago they had trembled, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself together. She had learned long ago that showing pain invited judgment. People measured pain, ranked it, decided who deserved sympathy and who was exaggerating. It was easier to endure quietly. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered to each other, occasionally glancing in her direction. Evelyn couldn't hear their words, but she recognized the looks, curiosity mixed with uncertainty. Should they feel bad? Should they say something? In the end, they said nothing at all, and the silence stretched on. The older flight attendant returned a few minutes later, kneeling slightly so she could speak at eye level. "Can I get you some water before we take off?" she asked. That would be lovely, Evelyn replied. As the attendant handed her the cup, she leaned in just enough for her voice to stay private. I've been doing this job a long time, she said, and I've seen how silly people get overlooked. I'm sorry you were. Evelyn met her gaze. Thank you for seeing me, she said. It wasn't a dramatic statement, but it carried the weight of years. The attendant squeezed her hand gently before standing. That brief human connection grounded Evelyn more than any apology from the airline ever could. A few rows ahead, Daniel finished securing an overhead bin with more force than necessary. He replayed the moment at the door in his head, irritation prickling beneath his professionalism. From his perspective, he had followed procedure. He had kept the line moving. Yet something about the looks he'd received from other passengers lingered, uncomfortable and accusing. He dismissed it as overreaction. People were always too sensitive these days, he told himself. Still, the justification felt thinner each time he repeated it. The man in the tailored suit, whose name Evelyn later learned was Marcus, watched Daniel discreetly. Marcus had grown up watching his mother navigate similar moments, watching her pride chip away under the weight of small humiliations. He recognized the look in Evelyn's eyes because he had seen it before. It was the look of someone deciding whether speaking up was worth the cost. After takeoff, when the cabin lights dimmed slightly and the city disappeared beneath the clouds, Marcus leaned toward Evelyn again. If you don't mind me asking, he said, do things like this happen often? Evelyn exhaled slowly. More than people realize, she answered. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's subtle, but it's always tiring. Marcus nodded. My mother used to say the hardest part wasn't the big moments. He said, it was the constant reminders that you're expected to accept less. Evelyn smiled faintly. Your mother sounds wise. She was, Marcus said. Time passed. Drinks were served. Conversations resumed. To anyone walking down the aisle, Evelyn was just another passenger, settled into her seat, another face among many. But inside her, memories stirred. She thought of segregated waiting rooms she'd seen as a child, of teachers who underestimated her, of doctors who dismissed her pain. The faces changed. The settings changed. The pattern didn't. A sudden jolt of turbulence rattled the cabin, drawing a collective gasp. Evelyn gripped her armrest instinctively. The sensation reminded her how little control anyone truly had once the plane was airborne. It struck her as ironic. Up here, everyone depended on the same thin metal shell, the same unseen pilots, the same physics. Yet on the ground, people worked so hard to draw lines between who mattered more. When the turbulence passed, the captain's calm voice reassured everyone. Applause rippled lightly through the cabin. Evelyn relaxed again, breathing evenly. Daniel moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts. When he reached Evelyn's row, their eyes met briefly. For a split second, something unreadable crossed his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it, and moved on. The non-apology hung in the air, heavy with what remained unsaid. Evelyn didn't feel angry anymore. Anger required energy she didn't want to give. What she felt instead was clarity. Moments like these weren't accidents. They were the result of unchecked assumptions, of habits formed without reflection. And while she couldn't change Daniel, she could refuse to internalize his judgment. Later, as the flight leveled out and passengers settled into movies and naps, Evelyn looked around the cabin. Popo laughed softly, shared snacks, complained about legroom. Life went on, even after moments that cut deep. That resilience was both a strength and a burden. Marcus stood to stretch his legs and paused by her seat. If you ever decide to write to the airline, he said quietly, I'd be happy to back you up. Evelyn considered it. She had written letters before, filled out forms, spoken to representatives, trained to apologize without committing to change. Sometimes it helped, often it didn't. I appreciate that, she said honestly. I'll think about it. As he returned to his seat, Evelyn rested her head back and closed her eyes. She imagined her sister's face, the relief she'd feel when Evelyn arrived. That was why she was here. That was what mattered most. Hours later, as the plane began its descent, the cabin brightened. Passengers stirred, gathering belongings, preparing to re-enter the world below. Evan felt the familiar mix of relief and apprehension that came with landing. The journey wasn't over yet. It never really was. When the plane touched down, applause filled the cabin again. As people stood and reached for bags, the aisle clogged with impatience, Evelyn waited, knowing it would take her longer to stand. The older flight attendant returned, just as promised. "Let's take this slowly," she said, offering her arm. Evelyn rose carefully, pain flaring briefly in her knees. She breathed through it, steady and practiced. As she stepped into the aisle, a few passengers shifted to give her space. Others didn't notice. That, too, felt familiar. At the aircraft door, Daniel stood again, thanking passengers as they exited. When Evelyn approached, supported by the attendant, he looked at her directly this time. There was a pause, just long enough to matter. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't accountability, but it was acknowledgement. Evelyn met his eyes and nodded once. "I will," she replied. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air rushed toward her, carrying the sounds of another terminal, another crowd. The incident would fade for many people the moment they reached baggage claim. For Evelyn, it would settle into the long collection of stories she carried with her, stories she shared selectively when someone needed to understand. She moved forward slowly but steadily, cane tapping against the floor, posture upright despite the ache. She had boarded the plane, she had arrived, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that her presence alone challenged a world that too often tried to move past her without seeing her at all.